Why are art, artistry, and artists both profound and powerful? Now, for those of you joining the Uncommodified podcast during this episode, I'm going to do something a little different as we start. I typically do not write a script, but in honor of being in the presence of two fine gentlemen who I feel actually quite dwarfed by, I decided I had to challenge myself to write something appropriate for the discussion tonight. So as I contemplated this question in preparation for this UNCORK conversation, here are my thoughts and my experience around this, because we're going to talk about art and artistry, and we have some artists with us tonight, so this will be an interesting conversation. So here's what I wrote in my musing. Art in its most profound essence is not merely a willful human expression, but rather a wondrously sacred portal into and for the soul, where creative creatures dance with the divine. For me, and possibly for you as you listen in, artists transcend mere methods and their chosen media and become mystical microphones that eavesdrop on the intimate dialogue between the great artist and the universe. In every artist's brushstroke and pen stroke, every note created and every word written, there lies an otherworldly whisper. Our yearnings to touch the infinite, and its or their, depending on your dispositions, desire to release the cathartic and catalytic possibilities of our extreme pleasure and our excruciating pain. The generous gift that can come to us through art is not just about experiencing the artist's final work. It is the gift of the pilgrimage, the gift of seeing everyone and everything more clearly from a different vantage point. It is both a mirror and a window. And in this most sanctified space, artists don't just create, they commune with a higher reality, crafting not just articles of exceptional beauty, but extravagant altars at which the astoundingly human, that's me for sure, and the approachable divine converge in the most uncommodified of all spaces. My friends, my listeners, this is going to be a different episode. It's being recorded live in Kris MacQueen's dining room. Yeah, if you're on the YouTube channel, it's a little bit different. So let me just introduce you. So welcome to this convergence of these ideas tonight. Very different podcast tonight, but part of a series, not fart, but part of a series.
That's why I'm here.
I know, that's why
I'll edit that out.
You edit that out.
Only the YouTube video.
Or the
YouTube viewers are going to hear
Or you can leave it in, Kris. It doesn't really matter. It happens. It happens. But this is going to be part of a series of podcasts that I want to do this year that explores the more spiritual dimensions of our lives. So a little bit different journey for those of you listening in. But welcome back to the Uncommodified podcast and to another UNCORK conversation. Today, my guest and Kris's guest is James Tughan, a renowned artist and author of a beautifully crafted book entitled Contact, The Artistry of Jesus in Nine Faces, a book that Kris is beautifully showing up. It's like Vanna frickin' White. I love it, Kris. Thank you. It is a book that I recently have come in contact with. Okay, this is going to be a fun podcast tonight. You're going to enjoy this, aren't you? This is going to be amazing. But this book is a book that a friend of mine recommended to me, Terry Black, who Terry is an amazing man that I've journeyed with for a number of years, and he wrote the foreword to this book. And he introduced me to the book, James, actually, and said, you got to read this book and you need to connect with James. So this book has been amazing. And so I'm going to be really taking a co-hosting role tonight. Kris is going to host the podcast. I'm going to co-host with him. And for those of you who know Kris, he's my producer who's been working with me for a number of years. He's a musician, artist. What else do you do? You're a facilitator, genuinely good guy. And for those of you who understand spiritual things, Kris is celebrating Lent right now. Not Lent, Lent. And for Lent, he has given up alcohol. Now,
for
James,
Lent, he's given up alcohol. It's true.
It is true. It is true for Lent, though. But
it's not a celebration, though.
No.
It's like I don't know. That's right. It's an observance.
It's an
I
observance.
like the idea of celebrating Lent.
Lent. Yeah, it's not Lent. It's not pocket Lent. That's different.
There's an idea.
Yeah, literally, it's pocket Lent. No,
It's Virgin Club Soda.
So he's got club soda, and I'm going to uncork the. I got writer's tears in celebration of James. And James has some writer's tears, but since Kris can't drink, we decided we let him smell the cork. Smell the cork. That's all you can do.
That's beautiful.
Okay, right. So
I'll see you after Easter.
Yes, there you go. So this is a podcast is subtitled "The Temptation of Kris."
This is awesome.
Okay, Kris.
All we're missing is the nimbus.
Oh yeah. All right. So, gentlemen, cheers to you. Cheers to you, James. Thanks for joining us on this crazy thing that is called the Uncommodified Podcast.
Just so that for those who are, you know,
There you go.
that'll be a nice little sound.
He has to hear this. Okay, Kris, baton pass to you. You introduce James, and here's my role tonight for my listeners. I'm going to be an eavesdropper. I'm going to maybe do an occasional interruption, but I'm the official kicker offer. So I've officially kicked things off, and I'm going to hand them off to you, Kris.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thanks for arranging this and for spending time with us, James. Introducing James, we've known each other for a chunk of years now.
It's at least 10 years.
Yeah. And similarly, Terry, I think, introduced us. Interestingly, James, I've been familiar with your work for longer than I've known you. And so I think it's awesome that we have you here tonight. I am not going to try to recreate the wheel. There's a beautiful introduction in the back of your book that I'm going to just touch. I'm going to steal from for this. You call yourself here, you are a visual artist, visually mapping with chalk pastels in a kind of cartographic realism. Mm-hmm. And you have, and I just love this work, you've really highlighted so much of the northernness of Ontario and the wilderness. Mm. And this idea of a visual metaphor. I mean, if there's one thing I think of when I think of the work that you do, it's, well, first of all, just intricate, beautiful detail. Mm-hmm. But everything has a meaning, yeah? Like there's just so much metaphor that lives in all of that. Your work has been featured in Rolling Stone, GQ, House and Gardens, Saturday Night Financial Post Magazine, Atlantic Monthly. You are not just a creator or an artist, you actually have a passion as an educator as well. Mm-hmm. And so watching creativity start to come out of other people, and particularly, I know both for adults, but particularly I've seen that working with some of the youth as well. And so part of what this represents is also a deep dive into poetry for you. Mm-hmm. And I just know in the years of conversation that we've had how important language is. And so to see everything come together in this, and we'll get you to talk a bit about this work here. This is this is a visual work. This is a work of poetry. This is a theological work. There's a lot that lives in this. And so, if we can just sort of start to dive in right off the hop, I am really interested in what you've said about this book. And I'm just going to read, this is a quote from it. And you said, this book is a small contribution to the world of theology, art, and psychology. And yes, yes, that's true. That is like one heck of a trifecta to throw yourself into the middle of. And so let's just kind of get things rolling. How does that intersect for you? Theology, art, psychology. Why that?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This is quite an honor. I think the answer to this question lies in how I grew into faith. My pathway into trusting in any kind of God comes through the pathway of mental health, the pursuit of mental health. I grew up in a family, that's where it comes from first. Yeah. And the theological and the artistic thing probably next, and lastly anything philosophical. Okay. It comes kind of in that order because of where I came from. Yeah. I grew up in a family that was dysfunctional, an upper middle class Christian family that was pretty messed up. It was a well kept secret, right? But I was probably clinically depressed by the age of 10. I discovered that without realizing quite how to put a name to it, but I knew it was going on because one of my parents was an alcoholic.
Right.
And so I'm going to kind of use this to come around to what you said about cartography as well. So my first job was to figure out how to survive this family. And of course, anyone who's, including our friend Paul, by the way, whose father was an alcoholic, you grow up, the one thing you grow up thinking like all the time is vigilance. Every word, every nuance is loaded. It's like growing up with the once American president. When I listen to that man talking, I hear one of my parents.
Interesting.
It's because, anyway, so my point is I discovered that the primary issue for me was safety, and being with, getting to a place of safety where I wasn't being emotionally trashed all the time. That took a long time to find. It happened that I grew up in a faith community, but the thing that saved me all that time, which when I'm looking back on it now, the two things that kept me sane were going north to canoe.
Yeah.
My parents had the good sense to put me in camp, and once I got there, I never wanted to come back. Is the problem. And being able to, I've always been able to draw and paint. I think I skipped kindergarten, put me straight into grade 1 because I could paint, apparently. So, and it's always been there, and that what that does is it gives you a way of processing all kinds of things. You don't even, when you're young, you don't even know what you're doing. You're just doing it. But when you put that together with the need to be careful and vigilant with someone who's really dangerous to be around, a certain style evolves. And for me, that was being very detailed and looking at the world from a higher point of view, like a cartographic point of view, like a map.
Aerial kind of looking down. Yeah.
And the interest in that is naturally triggered by with all the canoeing that I did, working from Ordnance Survey maps. I grew to really love them because they're so beautiful, and they contain lots of information about terrain, all the contour lines, which I eventually discovered is also true of Michelin cycling maps for Europe, which I used in Europe riding a bike, and also sailing charts. They all have this quality of either measuring depth or terrain, physical terrain. And of course, what maps do for you is that they let you know where you are relative to everybody else, and they give you points of entry and exit. And so on one level, you got to keep looking at the big picture. And when someone's talking about something and you sense threat, you need to know, how do I get out of the room?
Right.
How do I, what do I say? What do I not say? It's not a nice way to grow up. But the benefit of all this was that it turned me into a visual realist. And because in this little world, in this drawing, I can control everything that's going on down there.
Yeah.
And nobody can touch it. And when I grew up, all my parents and my family all treated it like it was magic, and they had no idea what to say to me. They just stood back and watched.
Interesting.
So I grew up with it protected, ironically enough, and I never endured a critique until I got to university. That whole time, never had any lessons. It protected me.
So there's a sense of it emerging as a kind of, almost a kind of constructed safety, safe space, and you're able to kind of get a sense of the lay of the land. And I forget what part of the human brain. There's the part of the human brain that is tasked with map making,
I'm sure, yeah.
Right? And it's really interesting. It is situational, but it's also relational.
Yes.
And so really interesting to hear that. And it makes a lot of sense when you just say, like, the perspective, you know, there's lots of things that you've done. I've seen lots of different works, but that is a very common thing of sort of getting a bit of a bird's eye view. And a question that just pops into my mind, particularly this idea of this experience of being somewhere else, and ironically, it's maybe in the wilds, and maybe also feels safe, which is an interesting thing. Often the wilderness is not the safest place.
It was for me.
Yeah. Is there a sense in even in some of the detail of almost taking some of that with you in a way that's maybe deeper than I'm going to take a snapshot of something, but like a reclaiming and bringing back, just as is that part of the original drive to capture? Or?
Well, when you're painting or drawing something in this much detail, the only way it can happen is if, and I think a lot of artists would say the same thing, is that, I mean, to draw that much is like maybe a day's work for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we're talking 3-4 inches by 3 or 4 inches.
What happens when you're drawing is that you're emotionally and mentally you're inside that place. The rest of the world just disappears, because what you're doing is you're making a cartoon come to three-dimensional life, which means, in the case of my language, depicting how light hits every surface. You're studying the behavior of light and texture. That's just it's how a lot of this has to do with surface and how it behaves. So it's very intimate.
Yeah.
It requires. I mean, for me, this came out of an immense emotional attachment to granite and lichen and the things that I saw.
Material.
It had very little. I didn't think it had anything to do with people, but in time I learned that that's actually not the case. But we're probably going to wind up coming back to that.
So a quick question that comes to my mind, and it's a bit of like, it's just listening to you share about that. I am astounded at this idea that you could spend an entire day in this little, again, 2 or 3 or 4 inch block. And yet when I look at the big picture that emerges from your work consistently, not just from this series, but Dreaming of Lions series, there is such a cohesive narrative that shows up, and it's not small. The integration of these parts that have individually consumed so much focus and time. Yeah. I feel like there's something in that connects into not just creative work, but we can sometimes get so focused in. And how do you stay contextualized to the big picture so that there's literally through lines that come across multiple paintings in really stunning ways.
Especially in this case.
And somehow you didn't get lost in that.
Well, I think to explain this, you have to sort of understand, a couple things. First of all, that the core skill behind any kind of artwork, but especially this, is design. Mm-hmm. Design is not accidental. It's intentional, and it requires a certain kind of drawing process. So in this book, people are going to see the finished suite of drawings, partly as chapter covers and or dividers, and partly there's a spread later on in the book that shows them all up on the wall together, which takes about 22 feet, I think, memory serves. That starts not with anything that looks like this. It starts with gestured doodles. Very much like Frank Gehry's sketch of the AGO that got put on the front page of the Star. It literally looks like spaghetti. In fact, when I'm teaching this kind of drawing, I call it spaghetti contour. You're just doodling and you're working out spatial relationships. You do the same thing with drawing figures. And it's a way of figuring out where things are relative to each other. It has nothing to do with detail. It's actually you're planning motion. It's like I don't know if there's a musical counterpart to this, but I know that in theater there is, where they block out a stage and they're all holding their scripts and they walk around and they do a walkthrough.
Yeah.
Well, for us, sketching is what you do with that, and then you, in this particular thing, you become. I had things that I wanted to accomplish with this project that required, and most of this occurred up north, sitting at a campsite, sitting on a table, doodling out sketches. I knew. Oh, let me back up. In this case, it started with the centerpiece, which has it's called I forgot the title of that. It looks like a box.
Okay.
And it's basically, it started as a student exercise with my high schoolers, where I made them build 3D little shadow boxes made of bits of wood.
Okay.
But it had to be a portrait. And then when they got it glued in place and all gessoed out, I made them do a drawing of it.
Interesting.
Okay. So that became then a still life.
Yeah.
And the drawing technique then is called it's trompe-l'oeil, and it's where we're drawing light and shade. Anyway, everyone enjoyed doing that so much that I decided to do 3. I did one for the crucifixion, I did one for the day after the crucifixion, and one for the resurrection. They were very abstract, only rendered as realism. And then I thought, a little light came on, and I thought, how does somebody go from having unimaginable artistic power to having none willingly? How does this is you may get to this eventually, but this is the story of Philippians 2. How does somebody who has unlimited freedom give it up? And I've indicated in how that happened, and it happened in the context of certain friends that we had. One in particular, we were going to do this show about escaping trauma, which I knew a lot about, but in the end, I couldn't get my head around the fact that the person we serve seems to have been on a collision course with it the whole time. I thought, I don't know any of my artistic friends that would ever do this, would give up their freedom with that kind of imagination. And we're a scratch on the surface compared to him, right? So and I thought, okay, I'll go back to the beginning, and I'll go from creation, and I got to the middle again, and wasn't sure how to finish it. I'm sitting at the campsite, and I'm trying to figure out how to do that, and I wound up using one more square. This was a commission, by the way.
Okay, yeah.
So there was a certain number of pieces and work involved, and I had to come up with a way of finishing it, and I wanted it to springboard off. So going back to my drawing style, that took the form of things that exploded outward, and I wanted the resurrection that's hinted at in this to be a kind of explosion of new creativity, and I wanted it to surprise people in a way, and I wanted it to be. You brought up this subject of metaphor, which I guess we're going to come back to again and again. It had to be done in a way that hadn't been done before. In our world, a lot of metaphors have been kind of beaten to death, and they do die. if you use them too much, like the cross, it's so overused nobody can feel it anymore, except for Mel Gibson, of course. Who just turns it into a bloodbath, and then we begin to get the idea. But so I posed a friend of mine, Mr. Charbonneau. I don't know if you recognized him in the drawing.
Yeah.
I posed him wearing some welder's goggles.
Okay.
And put I drew a blowtorch into his hand. That's not hard to do. And had the whole thing just fire off from there. That's how that, so, but that starts with doing this. And then later on design is work. You lay it all out.
Interesting.
You do hundreds of drawings and you layer them all down until you get what you want. And then you start rendering one piece at a time.
Interesting. You know, the one thing I want to say, and if you're listening into this podcast, again, it's a very different conversation than I might typically have, and I'm having it on purpose. And there is a purposefulness for me for this conversation, and it might just be about me. This might just be a very selfish, cathartic conversation for me. It might not be for the listeners, but I think it is. The one thing I would say is that, you know, you might be coming at this conversation either from either a no faith tradition or a faith tradition. Either one will cause you some consternation as you have this conversation, because you need to enter into this in a different way. And I think this is the one thing I would just say. If you come from a Christian background, you might need to suspend some things. If you come from a non-religious background or non-spiritual background, you're going to need to suspend something in this. But I think this was the attraction for me when Terry originally encouraged me to explore the book. You know, I'm coming at this from my own sort of deconstruction journey of my own belief system. And, you know, you made 2 points earlier in the conversation that was interesting to me. Your drawing is informed by light, which is interesting to me. Yeah. Your drawing and your understanding of the world is based on design. That ultimately it starts with a design, which is a designer. These are grand themes, obviously, that affected either the way that you view the world because of it, or you've come to view the world in light of it. I don't know which one follows what, but it is really interesting to me about the idea, because I'm not, you know, I don't draw for a living. I don't draw, you know, with this exquisite extravagance that you do. But it's very fascinating to me that it's actually the light that informs what you can find. There's a deeper meaning in that for all of us, right? Yeah. In the absence of light, you have no way of finding your bearing on this map.
This is called chiaroscuro. That's the Italian word that.
Interesting.
We owe this to Leonardo.
Huh.
And Sofumo. If you have a directional light, everything takes on dimensional terrain.
Huh.
It also infuses abstract work, but it's particularly important to representational imagery.
Huh.
Right?
Yeah. It's just so fascinating. And again,
it goes off into all kinds of other kinds of light in the middle of all that.
Powerful.
Light through glass, light through water, light through artificial lighting surfaces. Yeah. It gets quite involved eventually.
Yeah. And, you know, again, if you're listening in, if you listen to my podcast enough, you know, sort of this is where my mind goes. I would ask you to just either pause metaphorically or pause physically the podcast and ask yourself, what is light cascading on in your life? What's it revealing to you? What's it showing you? You know, and in this map making, this cartography, which is really interesting as you talk about this, you know, where are you starting to see dimension? Where are you seeing these lines in your life?
I want to come back to what
really
you said a little just before this, by the way. You talked about how it looks like there was a lot of planning that went into this. So the storyline that came out of these doodling drawings was, how do you go from movement and order to loss of freedom and being confined to a box?
Yeah.
So you can do that in design with different kinds of movement and lines and shapes. So if you'll notice that there's a progression that had to be planned as you go from 1 to 6.
Okay.
That goes the whole way the artist can make someone's eye move changes. And I deliberately did it so that the background would disintegrate, because the story I'm trying to tell is about falling into trauma. In trauma, you experience helplessness. You have no footing. You can't stop it. It's anyone who has been through any kind of abuse or betrayal, and it happens in so many ways. An assault, a robbery, a car crash, helplessness. How do you map that out? So this is where the first half of how I learned about that was that I discovered that my drawings were surfacing earlier on before this project, were surfacing hints about damage. And it turns out it's more interesting to describe something that's damaged than something that's perfect. It's way more interesting visually because you've got detail to work with.
That makes sense.
It's like in art college, all the models are old and fat and wrinkled.
Right.
There are no young
Hey, I can
people.
drink to that.
Hey, you have a second career.
You know what? I could be one of those models.
There are no perfect beauties in
Yeah.
in life drawing.
Ah, that's interesting.
But one of the reasons I love drawing the floor of the forest is that it's full of decay.
Yeah.
And I want to give a nod to a very important Canadian artist who has celebrated that, and that's Ernest Lindner, who's long deceased now, from Regina, who did these beautiful drawings of metamorphosis of lichen and decay in the forest. They're incredible. If anyone wants to look up somebody
Wow.
who kind of started this, it's him.
Wow.
So that's how the mapping of something, it started surfacing in my drawings anyway, like Lazarus. And then you start learning that certain kinds of shapes and devices and details suggest it. So you're learning a language that can be, without forcing a metaphor, whacking people over the head like they're idiots. Certain kinds of things tend to trigger associations with certain kinds of things.
Yeah.
So then it becomes a tool that you can use. And you listen to what your imagination is telling you. It's like a poet, or like when you're writing music. Certain kinds of sounds suggest certain kinds of things. And it just becomes totally fluid and natural. And that's what led to how this evolved in this particular project.
I just am so taken by the deep intentionality. So sometimes we can get so glommed on to the through line, to the plot line, to just the high points or what the point is. And there's something about intentionality, and then also context, paying attention to what's happening in the edges. I am by no means a visual artist, but I have dabbled. And when I have done so, I've personally paid attention to the thing that's interesting to me, maybe an eyeball or something if I'm trying to draw a face, and then absolutely disregard the other stuff. And I'm just noticing in just the intentionality of going, the texture that surrounds the story, and then this idea of, learning the language. And we've already looked at, you've already, I think, done some really good work in our conversation identifying the power of constraint, right? So there's constraint that is a binding thing, but then there are those constraints that absolutely enable, right? So
Absolutely.
One of the things that I like to think about, if we're thinking about people, shoot the moon with your thinking. What are we talking about? We're trying to think big, think without constraint. But if you actually stop and think about what's required to hit the moon, it's literally rocket science. There's no margin for error.
No.
And so just
Creativity occurs inside that construct.
Yes, yeah. And so I just really, really love that. And I don't know if there's anything that you want to add in terms of just the interplay of freedom and structure, the relationship of those things.
Well, first of all any musical composition, theatrical writing, visual art, poetry, dance, all operate inside of boundaries. There is no such thing. The notion of autonomous freedom is a modern lie. It's a myth, because everybody is operating within certain constructs, even if they don't know they're doing it. and all design occurs within boundaries.
Yeah.
Design a postage stamp. It can't be bigger than that by that by that, and it has to obey certain things. So if an artist says, "Oh, I just do whatever I feel like and whatever comes to my mind," I would suggest that modern neurology is proving that that's nonsense. They now know the way the brain works, that it's all conditioned by all kinds of contributing factors.
And so learning how to recognize and respect boundaries,
you got to learn how to
have a relationship with a boundary is an interesting idea. And I think that there are a lot of parallels that show up in relationship, in business, in all of the different spheres of being. Really, there's like, okay, what are the, because sometimes we can just hate the constraints, or we can really have a toxic relationship with that. And so it's just an interesting concept. I love it.
That is fascinating. I read a book a number of years ago, and in the book, the gentleman defines true creativity as succeeding within the box. In an interesting way. He says you can think outside the box all you want, but you can't really execute or live outside the box. And we all have boxes. And I think this is an interesting thing. And again, if you're listening in, you could apply that idea to your life about boundaries you draw or you don't. You could think about it in your business, as Kris just said. You could think about it in lots of different ways, because there is this powerful interplay between all of these things. So when you sort of crush all this together, James, when you look at your creative journey, you look at your history, you look at your faith journey, as you crush it all together, and you said earlier, which is sort of interesting, from a New Testament theological perspective, this idea that if we choose to believe the narrative that Jesus himself is God in a restricted form, in a chosen restricted form, which is this is the narrative, right? So when you talk about taking all this creativity, which now maybe the penny's dropping for me a little bit when I think of the artistry of Jesus, and I think of which is a subtitle of your book, this idea of the artistry of Jesus within this constraint of these faces.
Restraint is an important word.
Correct. Constraint and restraint. This is a really interesting conversation about, these are massive spiritual themes. Mm-hmm. And this idea that, from a Christian perspective, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, that God constrains himself within this infant child, and then within the limitations of a life. I mean, how should we view this, and how do we understand this in the arc of this, and then I guess the greatest constraint, which from what you say would be the cross, I suppose. This is a really powerful spiritual theme. What is that? What ought it mean to you and I? How do we understand it? And maybe how do we live in light of it or in spite of it? I don't know which one would be the right way to look at it.
My understanding from my experience has been that the purpose behind the restraint is, on his part, is because he's focused on communicating with us. That everything serves the purpose of him serving us. That, and to come back to the term you used about language before, I think that's a crucial connection to this. When, if you want to communicate to somebody that you care about them and you are concerned about their emotional welfare, which was the key issue for me. Is somebody think that the way I feel and what I want to be able to do or aspire to do, it, things that are hard to quantify but that are psychological, matter to him, that my safety and my sanity actually matters, then watching that person engineer ways of communicating that to me through people, through experiences, for putting people in my pathway who could help me get well, which I watched happening to me, all the way down to actually helping me get into therapy, which took a long time to get there, and to unpack the mess that causes clinical depression. But watching somebody care more about that than how many scripture verses I knew, or any of that stuff, right? It's not that that's not useful,
Right.
but that's not where the Lord started with me. So he put people in my path who were good listeners. And ironically, my father, who was also a victim in this situation, had me reading Paul Tournier at the age of 12. That's a little weird, because for anyone who doesn't know, Paul Tournier was a Swiss psychiatrist who came through the Freudian, Jungian, Adlerian stream, but who tried really hard to make sense of all this from a Christian believing point of view, which in huge sections of the Christian community is never happens.
Right.
So I didn't have many friends in this pursuit, and luckily I had my dad, and it kind of went from there. So I wrote down something about this. The purpose for the language and how I use it has to do with a question that I asked myself when I graduated from Waterloo in fine art. I knew I was headed into the market that there's a limited group of people who are realists. In our country, it's Christopher Pratt, Alex Colville, Ken Danby, a number of people like this. And I thought, okay, what's real? Is there anything distinctive about how I see the world as real? And for most of those guys, it's what you can touch and see and scratch. In fact, Mary Pratt says it's all about the skin of things, and it's the skin of fish of foil. There's nothing else that matters. But if you look at Colville, for anyone who wants to look up Colville, there's revolvers on the table. There's a guy in the woods with a shooting one. There's this message of impending death and violence. It's always latent there in his work. And I thought, I know what he's talking about. And then later I found out that he did this because he was a war artist. And he'd been in the Second World War, and he'd seen so many dead people. He never got over it. He had been vicariously traumatized by it. So it's in all his work, this edge of obviously another kind of reality. So I thought the answer for me is I have to find ways to allude to, at least, the fact that there's things we cannot see that are equally real. Human emotion. How do you hint at the fact that there's spirit? How do you describe a person or God you can't see? In fact, we're kind of ordered not to try that, except very, very carefully. And so that's what the language, and that requires design. To do that in a thoughtful way, that you don't put a scripture verse under every picture, but you map out something out, and then you allow you seduce the viewer into walking around inside this world that you thought up until they go, oh, what's that? Right? And it triggers stuff for them in their imagination. Does that help?
It's a powerful word. And again, if you're listening in, I mean, we create some structure for these conversations sometimes. And these questions that we shared, which we did. Well, obviously, these conversations don't ever really follow those things.
Sorry about that.
No, but you know what? It's James. I always say to people who come on my show, the conversation we're supposed to have will find us. And tonight I think is another example of that. I mean, as we talk about this and as we sort of muse through this, it's very interesting to me because, you're describing, you're describing in these pictures and I suppose desiring people to have this. The book's called Contact, to have some contact with something, with someone, and it's interesting to me because from this narrative, this biblical narrative perspective, we look at this, or we look at even the modern expression of Christianity in North America, maybe more particularly in the U.S. And I think this is my own journey. I think, as a young man, I was a man of deeper faith, and I was also a man of a triumphant faith, of a God or of Jesus of triumph, not of trauma. Yep. And I think the older I get, the more I understand that actually trauma is a big part of life, been part of my life, and that and that the idea though that Jesus, and you talk about this in the book, and you have this idea that Jesus somehow not only puts up with trauma, tolerates trauma, Jesus embraces it, runs towards it somehow. This idea is a bit. It's not anti, but it's very juxtaposition to the traditional understanding of this triumphant God. So I'm interested to know how your own trauma and then seeing Jesus through the lens of trauma, and how does that all interplay? And for those people listening who are asking themselves, what does this mean for me? How do they step back from this conversation, and how ought they observe their own life, but also to observe, if they were to get a copy of your book and enter into this journey, how do they understand this? Because we tend to love this idea of the triumphal God. I don't care what world religion that we want to espouse to,
the triumphal CEO, or the triumphal, like you name it.
Yeah, right? Triumph is king.
Yeah,
not trauma. So it's interesting that this king seems to be so at home with trauma. That's a very fascinating narrative and understanding.
It's not that he likes it, because he sees it in happening to people around him, and he's deeply concerned about them.
Yeah.
The trauma of all the women who were devalued in his own time, and the children, and him trying to elevate them.
Yeah.
Like he's trying. He can feel what they're feeling, and he is trying to create a different kind of psychological space for them, which in that culture would have been incredibly difficult to do. So,
it's amazing. It's fascinating to me.
I don't know. I'm not sure which part of that how I can answer that. I just if when shit happens to you, you can choose to bury it and pretend that somehow your faith is supposed to keep you immune to pain, or you can listen, and then you get sick.
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
That is what leads to clinical depression, because it is not natural to have to feel no pain.
Yeah.
You had to get angry. Or if someone violates you and is disrespectful to you, it is totally the way God designed us to feel brokenness and rage. But our faith community isn't big on acknowledging that, to be honest. So I grew up in that kind of community, and all this supposed joyful living that everyone else said was real wasn't true. I didn't have any idea what they're talking about. What I knew was all the symptomology that comes with depression. I would go to church every Sunday, and I know the document that the artifact, the Bible that we've grown up with, but reality for me was loss of memory, unexpected bouts of sadness that I couldn't explain, occasional panic attacks. This is symptomology of something else. And it wasn't until much, much later that I realized I better do something about it and unpack it and rewind the reel to figure out what caused it. And God facilitated that process. So I'm incredibly grateful for that. So, we could go down that road, a lot of detail there, but I learned that the Lord is empathetic and a good counselor, and He's not in a hurry. A lot of people live with the illusion that this gets fixed like that, in a miracle, and it doesn't. It happens in safe relationships. You got to get away from the source of the damage, get to a safe place, have a support system where you can heal, and that healing takes time.
Yeah, it does.
So,
Interesting.
Wow. I'm just really grateful that I was able to find that.
I have a question, and I think it kind of cuts across both some of the big picture of this idea of trauma, and I don't think anyone is suggesting that we having a party about it, but it seems to be there's a different relationship to it that you are calling out in the person of Christ in this and in your own story. But I don't know if this makes the connection, but I'm going to try it anyways. How do you respond to imperfections, let's call them visual traumas, mistakes that might happen? You've invested a lot of time in working on something, and maybe something goes, maybe that doesn't happen to you, James. Maybe every stroke is perfect. But is there a kind of a relationship there where does it become part of what emerges is working within some of that? Oh, I didn't plan for this, yes. And now as an artist, I'm going to now incorporate and maybe try to pull something out that I didn't expect to have to. I didn't expect to have to redeem this, but now there it is.
Well, it happens as part of the entire drawing process from the very beginning. You are looking for something in space. It's all trial and error.
Yeah.
If you look at somebody who studies how to draw figures, it all starts with gesture, and you're literally trying to step inside the thing you're looking at, or you can see, or you're inventing it, and you're making mistakes every second. But little by little, you figure out what you're trying to get at, right? And at the end of the process, all kinds of things happen in this process where you got to change something.
Yeah.
Or for me, the design process is, I got a very good idea of what I want to see. And it's not a fast process. This part of it, the rendering, takes me a long time. So I'm pretty careful.
Yeah.
But I have had certain projects where I either didn't know what to do and was stuck, really stuck. And I often tell my students, sometimes you're gonna, when you're designing something, you have no idea what to do. You're stuck. It's like to a writer, a blank sheet of paper. And then you get up in the morning and there it is.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you experienced this as a songwriter.
Never. It always just comes.
Yeah, right. Well, I've had that happen to me, and the best thing to do, I find, is just to relax and do something else.
And I'm guessing that the best things that the best outcomes, I'm guessing they don't involve finding an eraser and just, I'm guessing it looks like incorporating something. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe eraser is the main tool for fixing something that's gone sideways.
Well, I tend to ban erasers in my art classes.
Thank you. I took a risk, and I was,
No, I don't. When people are doing figure drawing, I don't let them.
So here we're in a conversation about trauma.
Because you learn more by redoing the drawing and doing it again and again and again and again.
And so maybe there's something in this in terms of our own relationship to things that go sideways, things that we didn't plan for. And what we want in the digital age, we want the undo button. In the olden days, we want the white rubber that we can kind of erase the thing and start over again as if it never happened.
In other words, it's play.
But when we play, but also when we think about like what is our relationship to this thing that actually we can't erase it.
Right.
We can't erase it, and neither is putting lipstick on a pig a very artful thing to do. But is there a way that something, and maybe we see some of that in your work and in the idea of this trajectory of the emptying, the self-emptying of Christ in this, of working within constraint, within scarring, within, and actually out of emerging something that's like a coherent, beautiful, invitational narrative. I don't know. So it's just what's in my mind as I take your entire vocation and turn it into a metaphor.
Well,
We're going deeper in this podcast than we've ever gone.
I think
good.
if you look at the whole span of biblical history, the whole narrative of the Jewish people, it's pretty hard to avoid the idea that, yes, God might know where it's all going to wind up, but that his dealing with his people is a series of reactions and reinventing the wheel. Like he gives them a way of doing things, and they say, no, we want to do this, like we want a king like everyone else has. So he gives them a king, and they screw that up, and it's a whole,
And it's the human story, right?
it's the human story
Yeah.
of leapfrog mistakes.
Yeah.
And he keeps reacting with imagination and creativity to re-engage them, so that there's the possibility of getting outside help to get back on something that treats people better, or whatever it is. Because usually people screwing things up involves damaging people, killing them, or ruining things for your kids, or whatever it is, but making a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
Case in point, David he did a lot of good things, and he made some very serious mistakes. And he experienced someone using their imagination to reconnect with him. So I haven't had too many drawings where once I know where I'm going, that I haven't been able to do it.
Figure it out.
Pretty much that's the sort of the function of being a visual realist. But if you're an abstract painter, or like more recently, I've done stuff with my students that are not in the realm of realism, but are much more expressionistic. And there's a series I'm working on right now that doesn't look anything like this. And you literally mask out and lay down color and make the next decision after that's dry. And then when that's dry, there's no way to plan it.
Oh, I would hate that.
I am finding it to be a completely different experience.
I would hate that.
But when this has come out of the fact that I'm working with students who, maybe 1 in 50 students has the patience to do this.
Right.
The rest of them all just want to mess around. So I have to relate to that, and they need to make that work for them to communicate. So, there's all kinds of trial and error going on. In most
you got surf who's in front of you.
Yeah. No, it's really fascinating. So this installation that is referenced in the book, where is the installation?
At the moment, it's in storage.
Okay.
It was hanging at my school
Yeah.
for 3 months.
Okay.
It has hung in the CBC building in downtown Toronto.
Yeah.
Right now, it's in storage because it's got no place to go. The problem with this is that there has to be hung in a very specific way,
Yeah.
and you need 22 feet of unbroken wall space, because all the pictures have 1 inch gap between them, so the backgrounds will line up. You can't just put it anywhere. You can't put it up in anyone's
So
house.
listeners,
Yeah. If you have 20 feet of wall space, and a
reach
public-
out. Who knows?
public
Not making
space,
any promises. We're not making any
we're not making
promises.
promises, but for a small fee. So, and a small commission. No, in all seriousness, though, I mean the other thing is that obviously you lose the overall scale of the work in the book. Obviously, you show the installation, but So these are, it's 22 feet long.
Yeah.
How high are the original
Each drawing is approximately 24 inches square.
Okay.
Okay. So if they go on a row horizontally, but when you get to the point of the resurrection piece, one is above the other, and it acts like a fulcrum to the whole thing. It's off center too, so it's the whole thing. All of history is there's a device that's we call that a structural metaphor.
Yeah.
So it's a device that's used to organize information. Like in the Renaissance, everything is based on triangles, because they're trying to be Trinitarian.
Right.
But it's all planted inside, right? You don't see it all the time, but it's always there. So this is a teeter-totter.
You artists, you're a subversive lot. You are. This is why governments and nations had to rail against the artists.
They always kill us first.
Yes, there's a subversive power in these artists.
And you get out.
The force is strong with these ones.
Yeah.
So let me ask you: did did the art and the art installation come first, and the book come as a second thought? Was this always one thought, one cohesive idea?
I didn't even have any idea of doing a book when I did the drawings.
Well, how did this come about?
Concisely. Because I know some of this story.
Well, the content of this book I submitted as a master's thesis where I'm going to school.
Okay.
And it was rejected.
Oh.
What I was told was that I'm always trying to do something that's too big.
Shame on you.
And I said to them, but that's kind of how I think.
Tough.
So
that's just the way it is.
It's just the way it is.
I can't understand. We're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to go to the end.
So I also needed. So I'm very fortunate to have a patron to whom I owe the fact that I'm still in my house. And when I thought about what these drawings could become, which got presented as a thesis idea and was turned down, I had a choice: do 2 more courses to get my master's, or spend another 4 months trying to rewrite the application. And I decided I didn't have any more time, so I'll do the 2 courses. And I approached my patron, and he commissioned all the drawings, and then he also commissioned the time to write the book.
Wow.
That's how I paid my way through the rest of the school into the doctoral level. Otherwise, I'm not there still.
Amazing.
So
I am very grateful that you saw that you basically snatched it from the jaws of no.
Wow.
And turned it into something that I think is a pretty remarkable piece of work.
Glad to have done it.
Yeah.
It was very satisfying to do.
Yeah. It's interesting as you said, James, and again, if you're listening in, maybe you're not an artist, but maybe you're a patron. And
we sure could use more of those.
Well, and what comes to my mind, and this could be nonsensical, could just be the writer's tears talking. I don't know what it is, but so the patron, although not an artist, actually creates space by their generosity, which then allows you to paint within it. They actually are part. They're equally creative and artistic, but in a very different way, a way that we don't typically define our art. But without the visual vision, the visionary of the patron who can create a space in which you can create in, because apparently, as you said earlier, everything has constraint, and we do live in a world that has constraint of time, finances, etc. But you know what's interesting is that it's a wonderful partnership between you and this patron, and it just makes me realize and makes me think that we can sit here and say, well, I'm not an artist, or we can say I'm not a patron, and then we can polarize, but we need each other, and empowering the gifts of one another is a tremendous high calling. And it goes back maybe to some of the things I said in the beginning. I think there is a spiritual thing that's happening within the arts community, but there's a spiritual thing that happens in the community of generosity. It's equally as wonderful, it's equally as mysterious, it's equally as dynamic, but yet we tend to look at these things in very diametric ways. And maybe part of the conversation as we sort of bring it together is that we need each other. We need the enablers, and we need those who have ability to work within that. And
you can't do work like this because of how much time it takes.
Correct.
Right.
Wow.
When I was a working artist in the communications industry as an illustrator and a designer, money's not the issue.
Right.
But when I decided to leave it, I discovered very quickly that the church, because of its disinterest in art in general, on the Protestant side of the universe, the Catholic world has never given this up. They still spend millions and millions of dollars on art worldwide. But there was no such thing as patronage on my side of the equation at all. So the Lord brought into my life a man who is virtually my Lorenzo de Medici, and who happens to be someone who's an art collector and who has a considerable collection that came into his life through his father. And so he knows what good art is. So my experience with the church has been, sadly, that they want us to do stuff for free, and then they'll pay some musicians and they'll pay pastors, but they won't pay for other kinds of art forms because they don't understand them. And it all goes back to the Reformation. So we've never gotten over it. So
Interesting.
Most of my friends who are any good at what they do have had to go where they can't earn the money to pay the bills. How are you supposed to own a house and a car and raise a family? How are you supposed to eat? Well, it's really acute in my case because these drawings take a long time to do.
Take a long time.
This is a year's work in this suite of drawings.
It's such a labor of love. It's such a powerful labor of love.
I don't find it taxing or wearying to do them. I know that to get something at a certain, like in the medieval world, when the church was the patron, or all through the Baroque era, the church was the patron. It was the main source of money, and then the Dutch invented the merchant class, right, along with the Italians down south, and they had lots of money, and that's how stuff happened.
Interesting.
If Rembrandt didn't get a commission from somebody, it didn't happen.
That's just interesting because we don't think about that when we think about art. So
the only reason Van Gogh made so many paintings was his brother paid for it.
Yeah.
Well, and I can sort of see how this all connects in my mind as we sort of finish up. But if people want to pick up a copy of your book, it exists in different forms. There's a beautiful hardcover, paperback or softcover version, which I originally got, which I feel, by the way, is dwarfed in its presence to the other book. I'm glad you brought another one.
You're not going to get over that, are you?
I'm not going to get over that. My pain is palpable. But how do people find this book? Contact the Artistry of Jesus in 9 Faces. How do they find it? Where do they find it?
Well, I just happen to have
Look
some
at you,
information.
being your own patron. I like it.
Someone's got into it.
Yeah.
Well, the book is on Amazon, but it's Amazon takes a lot of the money.
Yeah.
So the best place to get it is from the people who printed it, and it's called Bookshop.
Yeah.
And they have a website called Bookshop, where that's the softbound version.
Yeah.
The hardbound version, they're going to have people need to get it from me. I'm the only one who has them.
Okay. So
and then I can mail.
Okay. So in the show notes,
and there is a code that will help them save money if they want the softbound version.
So what we'll do is in the show notes to this podcast, I'll put this information. So if you want to track down the book that James has done, it's a beautiful book. It's a wonderful journey. I'd encourage you to grab it. I want to get some copies myself. I'll get some copies because I want to give some copies away to some people. But, as we bring this conversation together, there's three things that are sort of percolating for me right now. And I think this is where, these things crescendo for me. And it's like, so whether your instrument that you mark the world with is paint or pen or patronage, these are powerful instruments that we get to use, and I think this is where it comes together for me, because when we don't think about the enablement that finances bring to the arts. We see these as sort of these things in sort of these buckets that we look at life in. And I think that if you're listening in, you can diminish your sense that you're an artist drawing and making an impression. We're all impressionists. We're making an impression somewhere. And I think this is a great connection for me that, listen, if your calling is to make a mark on the world and leave it in indelible ink, that's great. You ought to do that. If your calling is to do it with indelible generosity and enabling other people around you through generous giving that will enable them to do what they're ordained to do by a divine entity, however you want to choose to address that divine entity, I think that is a powerful provocation. And I think we can diminish each other's gifts because we can think one is better than the other, but we all need each other in this journey. You need a patron who can empower you and give you the gift of time, the time that you need to invest in this powerful thing that you do, which is creating these visual maps, which is mapping both trauma and triumph. It's bringing this all together, James, in your own journey. And you have a website as well. What's the website if people want to find you there?
It's TUGHAN'S.wordpress.com.
Okay, so we'll put that in the show notes as well. What a wonderful conversation. So as we finish up, Kris, I'm going to give you a chance, and then we'll end with James. I mean, Kris, as you listen to this conversation, I've just shared some of my big themes that I'm taking out of this. And, I'm not an artist, but I would say that I've been given the privilege to be maybe a patron at times in
This
the
is
lives
patronage.
of others. It's patronage, and I find it a wonderful gift for me, because it allows me to actually leave a mark in a way that my hand can never do. So that's really awesome.
Okay.
Kris, what is your takeaway? And then James, we'll give you the last words of, what when we finish up, what would you want to say to the people listening? What do you want them to take out of this conversation and ultimately out of the book? But Kris, I'll leave it to you, and then we'll turn it over to James.
Yeah, I think that the thing that is really standing out to me is that it is very possible to be intentional in our work. I think we can be so interested in outcomes and timelines, and I think that's the thing that I'm really living in this conversation. The idea that we can pay attention to details and not get lost in them, and still become part of a greater whole. Just the coherence of that, and so that's the thing that I don't have a specific like this is the point, but it's really living with me. So I'm feeling challenged in that way, because sometimes I can be all about just the top line in the songwriting world. That's the melody. But there's so much depth in the surrounds and the context, and I heard so much context and intentionality in that. So that's the thing that I'm really lots to think about. But that's the thing that's kind of
James,
what I would react from what both of you said is that I believe the job of the artist is not. It's very popular right now for people to talk about beauty, and I think that's an unfortunate label, because a lot of life is messy. I think the job of the artist is to be truthful about whatever that involves. Like I know that you've talked about lament. You've talked at other times. Talk about things that aren't working, but we need all kinds of artists who tell the truth about what life is really like. And I think people who want to support the arts need to be looking for things that are more than or what seem to be comfortable and to make everybody feel good. some of the best artists in art history were very disturbing people. You know, I think of Goya, I think of, you know, Vincent, all kinds of people who created imagery that was meant to upset people and to protest against some kind of injustice.
Unafraid truth-telling.
Yeah, and to do that with excellence in design. So this is not permission to create crap.
Yeah.
This is permission to be perceptive and very, very good at, I mean, there's such a thing as good composition in music, and there's music, elevator music, and there's good art and there's weak art, and it's all about design. It's but it doesn't happen in a vacuum, which is what we've been talking about tonight.
Yeah.
It happens with intentionality.
It does, yeah. And there's so many other themes in James's book. Again, I would just really encourage you to get the book. There's, as James said, I mean, there's themes of lament and trauma. There's triumph. There's idolatry. There's worship. There's all of these themes coming together. There's this wonderful imagery of wings and fire and all of these metaphors. Things we don't talk about, and maybe we talk about it again because it's not enough to do in one conversation. But I'll end where I started, and again, if this conversation has provoked you in any way, do me a favor, email me at tim@uncommodified.com and let me know. Let Kris and James and I know how. So you're going to uncork this conversation in your life. But I'm going to go back to something that I intentionally wrote as I started, and I'm going to read it again because it's a place I want to finish, and that is the generous gift that can come to us through art is not just about experiencing the artist's final work. It is the gift of pilgrimage. It is the gift of seeing everyone and everything more clearly. It is both a window and a mirror. And in this most sanctified space, artists don't just create, they commune with a higher reality, crafting not just articles of exceptional beauty, even as James just said, but extravagant altars. And now that I read that again, in light of this, an altar is a dual metaphor. An altar is something historically that we might come with with great beauty and grandeur to. But an altar is also a place of sacrifice, of death, of brutality. It's a both and metaphor. And we come to these altars both of extravagant beauty and maybe of trauma in our lives. And that's the place that the astoundingly human and the approachable divine converge into these most uncommodified of all spaces. And so my challenge to you as you finish this podcast with us is, what will these provocations mean to you? How do you unpack it? Are you a pencil drawer or are you a patron? Are you investing time in creating art? Are you investing time in releasing art around you in any way or form that it should take? Because as we move into greater technology, we're going to move away from certain things that we're going to lose in the process. And we need to make sure that we are making sense of the maps of our lives. There's just so many things that we've talked about that are so powerful. And I know this conversation for me, James, will live on in a lot of different ways. It's I want to have this year. Kris, thanks for co-hosting and being part of the conversation, giving us your dining room to do this. And if you've listened in for a reason. Have a great day. Cheers. Thanks for listening in.
Thank you.
Cue the music.